Thank you for joining us on the Cook Memorial Public Library podcast. I'm Nate Goss. Instead of a new episode, today we wanted to use the next 3 episodes to share a 3-part podcast focusing on segregation and racism in Libertyville from the Drops of Ink student news publication at Libertyville High School. These episodes focus on the important impacts of segregationist practices and their consequences for today, particularly in our community. The series was originally published in the spring of 2016 and was put together and hosted by Conor Kennedy. Large portions of the series were recorded using the library's digital studios. Conor graduated from Libertyville High School in 2017 and is currently a senior at Yale. We wanted to thank Conor and we wanted to thank Libertyville High School English teacher Mr. Gluskin for their permission to share this work on our podcast. There's been a lot of discussion lately around race and equality and privilege. I've heard this refrain recently, especially from white people, that they want, even need, to do better, to listen, and to educate themselves. We hope these episodes can play a small part in that education within our library community. And so now, here is the first part in a 3-part series titled A History of Racism in Libertyville and the North Shore.
Welcome to Drops of Ink Radio, a podcast about the people and policies that shape the world around us. I'm your host, Conor Kennedy. Today, we're going to look at one of the most important and most damaging phenomena in American history, racism. And we're going to look at how it's played out right here in Libertyville. This is episode 1 in a 3-part series. Libertyville is an affluent suburb within a community of affluent northern Chicago suburbs near Lake Michigan, known as the North Shore.
Many years ago, when my daughter was in 5th grade, I came to her class. And it was one of these things where they ask parents to talk about their jobs or something. And I asked these kids, like 10 and 11-year-olds, when you hear the term North Shore, what do you think? And already they knew that, they said white, rich, snobby, elite.
That was Gail Schechter. She's the former executive director of Open Communities.
Open Communities is a housing, economic, and social justice advocacy group that covers the northern suburbs of Chicago.
These northern suburbs, though, are starkly divided, both racially and socioeconomically. One sector, so to speak, is the North Shore, which is comprised of communities with high income levels and that are mostly white. But bordering some of these municipalities are communities like Waukegan and North Chicago, which generally have lower income levels and are more racially diverse. And there's a lot of data to support this. You needn't look further than statistics regarding the racial and socioeconomic breakdown of high school student bodies in and around the North Shore. Last year at Libertyville High School, low-income students comprised only 6% of the student body, while at North Chicago Community High School, which is only 6 miles from Libertyville High School, 83% of students were low income. Race is similarly correlated. At Libertyville, 82% of students were white. At North Chicago, 2% were white. Of Libertyville's 20,000 residents, only 250 are black, while of North Chicago's 35,000 residents, more than 28,000 are black.
So why do we still live in communities that are still like 90% or more white or 90% or more black? What's going on here?
The answer is that we're still seeing the effects of racial segregation. Webster's dictionary defines segregation as the practice or policy of keeping people of different races, religions, etc., separate from each other. We tend to think of segregation as the overt racism of the South in the 19th and early 20th centuries, expressed simply by the defiant Alabama Governor George Wallace in 1963.
And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
But we Northerners don't tend to think of segregation occurring here. We didn't have, after all, the so-called separate but equal schools of the South, separate drinking fountains, blatantly discriminatory Jim Crow laws. But we nevertheless still wound up with communities separated largely by race, in separate worlds, one black and one white. One significant reason for this.
It is housing that determines very well whether you will have resources to retire at the end of life. That real wealth that's developed for most Americans is done through home ownership. Housing determines where your kids go to school, how secure you are, how your neighborhood will work. It is where you live and where you're able to live that makes so many decisions for us economically and socially.
That was Hillary Shelton. He's an NAACP administrator, longtime civil rights advocate. What you just heard was part of a speech he made at an Open Communities event held last July in Winnetka to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King Jr.'s march there. Because, yes, MLK came to Winnetka to protest housing discrimination in Chicago and the North Shore. Here's Jan Schakowsky, the congresswoman from Illinois' 9th District, who also spoke at the event.
It's hard to imagine this town or neighboring communities as inhospitable to minority populations, but it has not always been this way. News stories from the second decade of the 20th century highlight Wilmette residents' efforts to stop so-called the, quote, invasion, unquote, of African Americans to that village, and overt housing discrimination existed on the North Shore well into the 1960s. Real estate advertisements sometimes made it clear that non-white and non-Christian buyers would not be considered.
But it wasn't just private individuals and real estate companies acting on their own. There were well-established legal mechanisms to enforce segregation. One of the most damaging was called the restrictive covenant.
So first of all, there were communities that would adopt racially restrictive covenants, which meant that when you bought into the community, you were not allowed to resell your house to someone of a different race. And so it just explicitly restricted who could live in certain areas.
That's Professor Jonathan Maser.
My name is Jonathan Maser, and I'm a professor of law at the University of Chicago. The basic idea was that communities wanted to segregate themselves, and so a whole series of community members would all mutually agree to promise not to sell their homes to any non-whites. And so once the covenants were in place, it basically held the entire community or the entire neighborhood as sort of a white enclave that nobody else could get into.
Many real estate developers place these covenants on all the homes in their developments. As it turns out, racially restrictive covenants still exist on the original deeds of many properties. To find an example of one, I paid a visit to Mary Ellen Vandervenner, the Lake County Recorder of Deeds.
The Lake County Recorder is responsible for keeping track of every piece of property that has been bought or sold in Lake County. We have over 7 million recordings. Once it's recorded, it can never, ever, ever be altered or changed. You can never go back and cross out anything, take anything out of there, change it in any way, shape, or form. It is there forever.
Racially restrictive covenants were very common in cities and suburbs around the country, including right here.
It's kind of everywhere, too. The deeds were restrictive in Bannockburn and Libertyville and Antioch, just as much as they were in Waukegan and Park City and Zion.
We were able to easily find examples of these covenants in Lake County, and the language is pretty offensive. Here's the wording used in a deed on a house in Libertyville. Quote, "Said premises shall never be sold, transferred, or leased to any person or persons of the African or Negro, Japanese, or Chinese races," end quote.
You could not sell or rent to anybody who they believed was that should not be in their neighborhoods, and that's how some of these neighborhoods were built. It's horrible, really, but it's just the way that it was.
The issue was that courts were upholding them.
That's Professor Maser again.
So, the first people started out, they wrote racially restrictive covenants, and throughout the late 19th century and early 20th century, courts were willing to uphold them. So there would be cases in which homeowners would want to sell to a black family despite the racially restrictive covenant, and courts would prevent them from doing so. And so it was only in the 1940s, in the famous case of Shelley versus Kramer, that courts said that racially restrictive covenants were unconstitutional and that they were not going to uphold them. But certainly, they're now viewed as incredibly immoral. Post-1948, post-Shelley versus Kramer, they were viewed as highly immoral, whereas before that they were viewed as sort of a regular facet of everyday life.
What made many of the segregative policies of the first half of the 20th century so effective is that they were very difficult to challenge using conventional legal norms. racially restrictive covenants were especially difficult to eradicate.
Well, it's interesting. In fact, I think that the more shocking thing is maybe not that they were enforced for so long, but that they were ever actually viewed as unconstitutional. The problem is that the Constitution only applies to state action, which is to say government action. So things that private individuals do, things that you or I might do, can't run afoul of the Constitution because we're not governments. It doesn't apply to us. And racially restrictive covenants were not government documents. They were just contracts signed between private parties. So, all the homeowners on a particular block or in a particular neighborhood might get together and sign a racially restrictive covenant. And so for many, many years, constitutional challenges to racially restrictive covenants were just tossed out of the courts because the courts would say that there was no state action going on. The government wasn't really involved.
While Southern governments had passed Jim Crow laws that explicitly separated the races, requiring separation on trains and buses and restaurants, in the North, segregation was achieved privately without having to pass Jim Crow laws. Racially restrictive covenants were one example of that. Another, perhaps equally important one, was called redlining.
Redlining was basically a private practice by which often banks and sometimes realtors would refuse to sell homes or to write mortgages to black families in certain neighborhoods. So if you were a black person, you wanted to take out a mortgage, they might let you take out that mortgage in one neighborhood, but not another neighborhood. Or the realtor might show you a house in one neighborhood, but they would refuse to show you a house in another neighborhood. And the reason for this was because they wanted to keep black people confined to certain neighborhoods and not allow them to live in others. And it was called redlining because banks and realtors would actually have maps up in their offices with red lines drawn to separate areas in which they were willing to write mortgages and show houses to black people and areas in which they were not. And this was a very widespread practice. It was very common in Chicago, in the Chicago area. It was very common in the Northeast, and it had, as you can imagine, enormous effects because there were whole areas of cities, whole townships that were open or not open to black families who wanted to live there. And so it was tremendously powerful in restricting integration. It was tremendously pernicious in promoting segregation. And redlining was outlawed by the Fair Housing Act in the 1960s, but it continued up until that point.
Can the effects of redlining still be seen today?
You can most certainly see the effects of redlining still in evidence in the cities in which it took place. I do know that redlining was very common in the city of Chicago, and it had a very powerful and pernicious effect. So if you look at the racial composition of the city of Chicago now, and you look at which neighborhoods have become predominantly black and which are predominantly white, there is a very, very strong correlation between that and what sort of redlining took place 60, 70, 80 years ago.
Coming up on our next episode of Drops of Ink Radio's exploration of race and racism in the suburbs, how it got this way, and a lesson in history that still lives with us today. Thanks for listening.